During the 18th century, the 1700s, there were two main styles. One was known as the Rococo, and the other was Neoclassicism. So first, let's look at Rococo art. Rococo, or Rococo, is the late Baroque style of the 18th century. It's a lighter, airier version of Baroque. It features pastel colors, curving decorations with these little dainty tendrils. Everybody seems to have lost weight. The figures are more slender, sometimes very dainty. And in many cases, there is a kind of playful spirit and subject with some of the paintings. First, I want to show you a Rococo church, a work of Rococo architecture. And then we'll be looking at a Rococo painting. And to do this, what I'm going to do is compare with a Baroque church and then a Baroque painting. This is the church of Vierzehnheiligen in Germany. It's designed by one of the premier Rococo German architects, Johann Balthasar Neumann. And you could just call him Neumann if you like. The church of Vierzehnheiligen is the church of the 14 saints, or the holy helpers, we would say in English. And since I know most of you don't read German, let me break this down for you and show you how this is 14 saints. Vier, V-I-E-R, is 4 in German. Zehn, Z-E-H-N, is 10. And Heiligen, or if you just have one saint, Heilige, Heiligen, H-E-I-L-I-G-E-N, is saints. It's where we get our word holy, from Heilige. And so you have 14 saints. These were very, very popular saints. They had been popular for centuries, and they were often called the Noodhelferen, the helpers in time of need, or in English they just called them the holy helpers. There were 7 female and 7 male saints. This was a pilgrimage church. People would come to it to venerate the relics of the saints. People felt that if you had the physical remains of a saint, it somehow was still imbued with its sanctity, the holy person's sanctity. And it was like you could get closer to them, and perhaps even they could hear your petitions for healing or whatever it might be, if you were in the place with the relics of the saints. But anyway, it's a very, very beautiful church in honor of the holy helpers. I want to compare a Baroque church from the 17th century and a Rococo church, Vierzehnheiligen, from the 18th century. The church that I picked out to illustrate Baroque is a church that was designed by Bernini, San Andrea al Quirinale in Rome, which would translate as St. Andrew at the Quirinale. That's the Quirinale Hill in Rome. And as we look at this, you're seeing the main altar with a very robust columns, a painting in the section between the columns over the altar, lots of gold, bronze work around the painting, lots of decoration, a curving entablature, a very elaborate pediment that swings in and out and has a statue of the saint ascending into heaven up above. The proportions are robust compared to the Rococo, where you have taller, slender, engaged columns here, for example. And many of the decorations end in these little curling arabesques or tendrils, a little bit daintier in the proportions of some of the decorations. Also, the colors are a little bit different. With the Baroque work of art, you have a variety of variegated marbles, and you see this is a reddish marble. And then you've got the gilded bronze, and of course the white decorations, but you've got a lot of rich colors in there. With Rococo art, there was a kind of preference for light colors. Often the architecture is white walls, marble, like that, with gold trim. And a lot of the decorations, of course, are gilded, and you see a lot of white and gold. In this case, you do have some other colors. As you can see, you can have this kind of light variegated gray of the pilasters. But once again, it's lighter, airier, if you will. And here we're looking at the facade of Vierzehnheiligen. And you can see that it has an entranceway that comes out. There's a lot of decoration, particularly these towers that sort of go in and come out. It's almost like they've got poofs on them. Very ornate. And then if you look at the plan, it is, in a sense, a Latin cross plan. You have a longitudinal axis going down the nave to the large choir, or eastern end, apse at the end. And then you have sort of these two projections that you can see as the cross arms just below the choir. But it's a little bit different. Essentially, you have rounded areas, and the decoration on the ceiling is a variegated oval form, with a lot of swooping in and out around the edges. So let's take a look at that. You can have this sort of curly frames, and you also have more ceiling painteds, and once again they you have almost scallops and decorations coming out. The altar and the shrine are just richly encrusted with all of this decoration, which you also see in the Baroque period, but here it goes even further. And once again, the proportions of the decoration are lighter. And here we see, again, you can see another view of that shrine in which the relics would be placed. And then here we're looking at the high altar in the apse. And once again, white and gold, and it's almost encrusted with all of the very ornate decoration. For our example of a Rococo painting, I've picked a painting by Jean-Antoine Watteau. He is, somebody call him Franco-Flemish. You can call him French. He works for the French court, and a lot of Rococo art is associated with the French court. It's considered to be a kind of courtly art that reflects, not the concerns of just ordinary people, but the concerns of the aristocracy. This painting has gone under many names. The Journey to Cythera, The Departure from Cythera, and A Pilgrimage to the Island of Cythera. So I need to explain what's going on here. Cythera is actually a Greek island, and it is one of the islands with, for example, Knidos and Cyprus, who claim to be an island of Aphrodite or Venus. One of the places that Venus, when she rose from the foam of the sea, first stepped foot, or a place where there is the worship of the goddess of love, Aphrodite, or Venus in the Latin. And so what we're really talking about here is a kind of fanciful idea of a mythical island of love. And these aristocrats are taking a vacation from the arduous work at the court, where there's so much backbiting and political events, and they're going with their lovers to the island of love. And you see the boat on which they arrived, this very fanciful boat right down here in the lower left corner. And the person who's driving it, who's poling it along, is actually the god Mercury. And there are many, many putti who are cavorting in the sky above this little boat. These are the little loves. What are these aristocratic couples wearing? Well, they're wearing satins and silks, but you might notice they don't have, towering headdresses or huge farthingales. They're wearing what they actually believe to be peasant dress. Not any peasant ever had clothing like this, satins, for example. But they're a simpler kind of costume. And so this is what our own professor, Peter Polovets, calls the urban pastoral. People getting away from the city, going out to this imaginary pastoral or garden-like, shepherd-like world. There was a belief that there once was this realm, they call it the Golden Age, the realm of Arcadia, in which everybody lived in peace and harmony. Everybody was simply shepherds. They didn't have to do a lot of work. They obviously knew nothing about agriculture or raising sheep, but they didn't have to do much work. They just sort of made love, made music. The sheep kind of tended for themselves. And that's the feeling they're evoking. There aren't any sheep here, of course. There's a statue of Venus, which is draped with her favorite flower, roses, a flower we associate with love to this day. And everybody is in couples, as you can see. What I thought I would do is compare it to a similar subject by Peter Paul Rubens, one of the most representative and famous of all of the Baroque artists, of all of the Baroque painters. And if Watteau's pilgrimage to Cythera is an island of love where everyone is in couples and they're going to have a nice day away from the court, just enjoying themselves and making love and having a good old time, we see here Rubens' Garden of Love. It has a large architectural structure there, and then the gardens you can see sort of in the distance on the left. And I will say that one thing about Rubens' Garden of Love that's very different is that we actually do have married couples who are in love in this garden. But I wanted to point out some stylistic differences between these two pictures. With Rubens and the Baroque, you have these robust, voluptuous figures. With the Rococo period, you have dainty, slender figures. In both cases, you have beautiful stuffs, satins and silks that reflect the light, but the colors of Rubens' fabrics and garments is richer. You have deep blues, artemisia gold, some brilliant vermilions or reds, where with Watteau, you have pastel colors, much lighter, pinks and roses and paler blues. Both of them are very painterly artists, very free with the brushwork. And so here we take our departure from Cythera and I guess go back to the heavy duties of being an extremely wealthy and aristocratic courtier at the French court. Well, we want to look at a specific painting, specific work of art by a 18th century artist working in the later 18th century, Élisabeth Vigée-Lebrun. Now, her actual name is Marie-Louise Élisabeth Vigée-Lebrun. And I do want to caution you, do not call her Lebrun. There is another artist, a 17th century French painter named Charles Lebrun. So if you say Lebrun, you're talking about Charles. But you have to use her entire hyphenated name, Vigée-Lebrun, to refer to our female artists. Now, of course, most of the artists were male. But I think sometimes it's interesting to show you that there were some female artists. And there were more and more women artists as time went on. There were two very prominent French portraitists at the French court. Vigée-Lebrun was the court painter to the Queen, Marie-Antoinette. And Adelaide Labille-Giard was the court painter to the Mesdames, as they called them, the sisters of the king. Since we don't have time to talk about both of them, we're just going to talk about Vigée-Lebrun. But Labille-Giard is an excellent painter, very wonderful painter. Now, She worked for Marie-Antoinette, and she was working for her at the time of the French Revolution. And as you know, during the French Revolution, even people who were not aristocrats, if you had an association or were suspected of sympathy for the aristocrats, you could be executed with the guillotine, which was, you could be executed with the guillotine, known as the Red Widow. But Vigée-Lebrun was able to escape the French Revolution. She got out in time. She traveled to other courts for quite a while. She was in St. Petersburg in Russia, which incidentally was a French court. They spoke French at the Russian court. So she worked there for quite a while. Eventually, people who had fled the revolution were allowed to come back to France and live there, and were not persecuted. So in her old age, so later on, she came back to France and lived to be a very old woman. Her style is a style of fluid brushwork, and that will associate her with the Rococo style. There are some works of art, however, where she has a portrait of herself and her daughter where she's wearing classical dress. Not this one, obviously. I should say a few things about Vigée-Lebrun. She was not an aristocrat. She was, we call them middle class. She was a painter, but she became a kind of trend setter within the court, and she was, I guess you'd say, she was fashion plate. She sometimes used clothing that was not as restrictive and binding, with these huge farthingales and tight cinched corsets. And here you can see she's wearing what is a lovely dress, but much simpler than court dress. She has a kind of turban hat on her head and a ruff that is not stiff at all. So she's dressed in beautiful clothing, but I guess we'd say for the 17th century much more sensible than we sometimes think of as court dress. She painted many paintings of Marie-Antoinette. And the one we're going to look at is a painting of Marie-Antoinette and her children. I should say a couple of things about Vigée-Lebrun. It wasn't easy being a female artist, and it wasn't even easy being a court painter. There were lots of stories and scandals, and people would say things that weren't true. There's a lot of backbiting going on. At this time, there was the French Royal Academy, which was the most prestigious organization, sort of the government arm for the arts. And to be really considered to be a professional artist and to have some stature, you had to be admitted to the French Royal Academy. You had to be voted in. Well, there were only 4 women admitted to the French Royal Academy. One was a wonderful still life painter known as Anne Valère-Coster. Another was the wife of one of the male members. And then there was Vigée-Lebrun and Labille Giard, who were both court painters, and essentially they felt that, probably the Queen and the sisters, insisted that they be admitted. They were certainly qualified, as we often say today. They were overqualified. They were excellent artists. The male members of the French Academy did accept them, but decided that they would establish a quota. They had 4 women. No more than 4 women could ever be admitted to the French Royal Academy, although an unlimited number of male artists could be admitted. So let's look at this portrait of Marie-Antoinette and her children, which interestingly enough was a very controversial picture. It shows the Queen and her children in the Palace of Versailles. You can see on the left the Hall of Mirrors. And it shows her holding a baby with the daughter leaning up very lovingly against her mother. And then the little prince on the side is pointing to an empty cradle. Now, I looked at that and I thought it was the cradle of the baby, but it's another reference. The empty cradle refers to the fact that the queen lost a child, a child that died very, very young as a baby. And so there is this idea of sympathy. She, like other women, even the queen herself, can lose a child. The fact that the little boy is standing separate suggests, of course, he is the heir to the throne. He is the little dauphin who was not executed simply because he died in prison with the French Revolution. But he's standing separate because, as the male heir to the throne, he's going to be able to stand up on his own. He's not as dependent on his mother. Now, one of the interesting things about this is we see the queen portrayed as a good mother. I think when most people think of Marie-Antoinette, they think of someone who's very unsympathetic to the poor and let them eat cake and wearing lavish dresses and headgear and all sorts of things like that. But here she is as a wealthy, aristocratic woman, undoubtedly. She's wearing satins and beautiful clothing. She's wearing velvet and beautiful clothing. But as a woman, as a mother, Marie-Antoinette was not French. She was Austrian. And her job as queen, the most important one of all, was to provide an heir to the throne, which you can see here she has done. Here is the little dauphin, the little prince. And she has, of course, other children. And she's being shown not as a haughty aristocrat. She's being shown as a good mother. During the 18th century, this theme became very, very popular in literature and in art. You often see the good mother theme. And you might say, well, isn't it just normal and natural for a woman to be a good mother? Well, we assume that. But remember, throughout the ages, and today in many, many places, women were sometimes told, don't get too attached to your children because they might die. Aristocratic children and sometimes even upper middle class children be turned over to the wet nurse. But during the 18th century, there was a new philosophy that had to do with what they thought was natural. And they thought it was natural for a woman to love her children and to be a good mother. And this was promulgated in philosophy and literature and in art. So here we see the queen as a good mother. It's a good moral theme, but it's also political propaganda, if you will, showing the human side of the queen. She's done her duty. She's given an heir to the throne, and she's also has children whom she loves and who love her. The second style that I want to talk about that became very, very prominent in the late 18th and into the 19th century was Neoclassicism. In fact, there is also a neoclassical revival with some artists today. But when we think of Neoclassicism, we think of an art movement from the late 18th and the early 19th century that is based on classical antiquity. Neo, new, classical, classicism, the new classicism. Now, they could see classical sculpture and architecture. There wasn't a whole lot of classical paintings besides, say, Greek vase paintings or something like that to be viewed. However, in the 18th century, they uncovered the ruins of Pompeii and Herculaneum. Now, they're in the process of digging them out, and they don't have photographs. So when they publish the paintings that you would have seen at Pompeii, they're published as line drawings, which many of them are very painterly. They're very impressionistic or sketchy, but they would be published as line drawings, line engravings, and this would, of course, reinforce the idea of linearity as a classical style for painting. Also, the high Renaissance artists, Michelangelo, Raphael, they would look through them for a painting style. In fact, at this time, the neoclassical artists regarded Raphael as the greatest painter who ever lived. Neoclassicism was very interested not only in the style of art, but also in the subjects that were painted. And they felt that the greatest art had lofty themes, could teach a moral message. These lofty themes, they believed, could be carried in narrative and allegorical pictures, which they called history painting. And they considered history painting to be the most important subject. Now, what is history painting? History painting is mythological, allegorical, religious, and historical subjects. The themes are lofty, usually narrative themes. They were supposed to teach a moral lesson, and of course, the main emphasis is on the human figure, very much like Renaissance art, from which they draw some of their ideas and style. They also believed that there was a hierarchy of subject matter. History painting was on the top. When you had a great exhibition and you were giving prizes, the history paintings would always be in contention for the grand prizes, the first prizes. Now, this didn't mean that they said you shouldn't paint anything but history painting. Also, people painted portraiture. In fact, that was probably the bread and butter of most of these artists. They might paint the history paintings that might be purchased by someone, but also they would get a name from these, and then wealthy people would have their portrait painted by the famous history painter. And then, of course, there are other artists like Vigée-Lebrun who specialize in portraiture. Now, portraiture and genre painting in the sense of everyday people doing everyday things, are a little lower on the hierarchy from the history painters. They're still pictures of human beings, but maybe they're not as important a subject as, say, classical mythology. Down lower on the hierarchy, you'd have things like animals, landscapes, still lifes. You could still win prizes with your animal, landscape, and still life paintings, but never the grand prize. We're going to look at two neoclassical painters. The first one is Angelica Kauffmann. She is a Swiss artist, but she lived in Italy, in Austria. She had continental, that's the European continent, aristocratic training before she came to England, where she lived for about 15 or 16 years and was extremely popular in England and very influential on the Royal Academy, as we'll hear. She helped to introduce neoclassicism to Britain. And it was at this time that they were founding the British Royal Academy. And I have read that she was considered to be one of the founders of the British Royal Academy. She became a very good friend of the first president of the British Royal Academy and the founder of the British Royal Academy, Joshua Reynolds. And she actually, I have read, had even more neoclassical training than he did. But it was highly unusual for a woman to be a history painter. So she really is not absolutely unique, but she really is unusual in this. Why couldn't a woman be a history painter? Why would she, supposed to be a portrait painter like Vigée-Lebrun, or a genre painter perhaps, or a still life painter? Those were all acceptable for women. But it was really unusual to be a history painter. And remember, history painting was the top kind. So part of it is, well, women can't do the very best things. This feeling of female inferiority, which has a long history. But also, women were forbidden to study the nude. It simply was totally improper for a woman to look at a nude figure. So, how is she supposed to learn anatomy? And since the human figure and the nude human figure were the main players in a history painting, if she couldn't learn anatomy, then she couldn't be a credible history painter. So what did Kauffmann do? Kauffmann had to abide by all the conventions as well. But she learned anatomy from classical statues, Renaissance paintings, other maybe Baroque paintings, and from draped models, draped figures. She would not have let's say, a male model in her studio completely nude. He would always have a drapery across him or something. So she did manage to study anatomy, but with restrictions. And she did rather well with these, the restrictions and the limits placed on her. The painting that we're going to look at by Angelica Kauffmann is a painting of Cornelia, the mother of the Gracchi, these famous Romans. Her two boys grow up to be very, very famous Romans in the future. And she is the model of a good Roman matron. And Angelica Kauffmann paints a lot of these classical subjects. Some of them, the subjects may not be as familiar to us today as some other mythological subjects. This is one of them. It is Roman history, a classical subject, and it has the good mother theme. What is going on here? Well, we have Cornelia standing sort of just off center as the erect, upright matron in white and gold. And her friend has come to visit. And here her friend in this rich red is seated there with her jewelry box and is displaying her jewelry. And so after her friend has shown her all of these beautiful jewels, the friend says to Cornelia, "I've shown you my treasures, or I've shown you my jewels. Please show me yours." And Cornelia points to her children and says, "These are my treasures," or "These are my jewels," depending on your translation. Now, you'll notice that the little girl is very, very interested in all this sparkly jewelry. She's not wise enough to have the virtuous character of her mother, who is the model of a good Roman matron. And so here we have a classical version of the good mother theme. The composition, when I start describing it, some of the things are going to sound like a Renaissance painting. That's what Neoclassicism modeled themselves after. In fact, look at the female figures. They are ideal figures. The friend with her straight Roman nose and the rounded jaw. Cornelia with her perfect oval face, and once again, there's a straight nose that you sometimes see on, say, Greek face paintings or something like that. The composition is carefully balanced. It's not rigidly symmetrical, but essentially it is. Cornelia is sort of in the center, maybe a little bit off center. And you have this group of the friend and her child, the little daughter, Cornelia's daughter, on one side, dressed in warm colors. On the other side, the boys are coming in. It looks maybe the boys have been outside and they're coming in. Once again, the boys are more independent. They're not holding mommy's hand. The older brother is looking out for the younger brother. They're good brothers. There's a little separation. Cornelia's gesture leads our eye toward the boys, who we know will grow up to be famous Romans. The colors are warm. There's reds, peach tones, golds, warm browns, and just a little touch of coolness with this sort of atmospheric, very generalized landscape in the background of the blues. So just a very beautiful picture with a lofty moral message of being a good mother. The next artist you've all heard of. His name's Thomas Jefferson. He was the author of the Declaration of Independence. He was the third president of the United States. He was the founder of the University of Virginia, which he said was his proudest accomplishment. What's he doing in an art history class? He was also a gentleman architect. That wasn't his profession. His profession was a plantation owner. But he designed a number of buildings. The Rotonda at the University of Virginia, which looks like a brick pantheon. He also designed the State House, the Capitol building for Virginia at Richmond, which looks like a Roman temple. And he designed his own house, Monticello, which is what we're going to look at. Now, Jefferson, like most of the founding fathers of our nation, had a good humanist education, and he read books such as Vitruvius's 10 Books of Architecture, which was a very, very famous Roman book on architecture. They still have it. I've actually seen it on display with Jefferson's little notes in the margin. And he also would have read Palladio's 4 books of architecture, so on Renaissance architecture. So these are classical and Renaissance influence on art not only of England and France and Europe, but also on the new American country. And here you see Jefferson's home, Monticello, located near Charlottesville, Virginia. Many of you have probably been here and visited it. And it is a perfect example of neoclassical architecture in America. It is his home. And as you look at it, you'll notice a number of things. It has a porch that reminds you of a Roman temple. It's got a pediment. It's got columns. It's that looks very classical. And it also has a dome, which you see. In this case, an octagonal dome rather than a hemispheric dome. But one thing that's very interesting is those columns and that pediment are not marble or some kind of stonework. They're actually wood, and they've been painted white because the neoclassical artists believed that the architecture and statuary of ancient Greece and Rome was always the white marble. And of course, later on, archaeologists realized that most of these buildings had actually been painted originally. But when they were rediscovered, they looked white, and they thought that was the appropriate color for buildings in the classical style. So what has Jefferson done? Rather than bring in very expensive marble, and maybe even import it, he's used wood, which has been painted white. He's also used brick or clay, native Virginia clay, to make his house. So he's using neoclassical style with Native American materials. Now, where might we see something like that? Look around the ETSU campus. Dawson Hall, Nix Hall. You have a portico on front that's white, and then a brick building behind. So, Thomas Jefferson's legacy is very, very much on the East Tennessee State University campus. Let's look at some of the classical elements. We've already mentioned some of them. The domed rotunda as you walk in. It is pretty much a centralized plan with wings going off from that rotunda, and the classical temple facade. And what is he basing this on? Not only what he's read in books, but also, what? The most famous round domed building in the Western world is the Pantheon in Rome. And of course, it's not brick, it's concrete. It may have been faced in brick once. And it is a round room with a hemispheric dome and a portico, a classical temple portico or porch out in front with stairs leading up. You can't see the stairs in the picture because the ground level has risen, so they've been partially excavated, but you can't usually see them in photographs. And then you see, if you just look at the center of Monticello, you can see a dome, in this case the octagonal dome, and the portico with the pediment and the columns and the staircase leading up to it. Some other buildings that we've seen. that could be influential on this is what? The Villa Rotonda by Palladio. And remember, he's reading Palladio. And we look at this and you say, my goodness, doesn't it look like it? Once again, he's using brick. They're using marbles, stone. But you have your portico in the front and your dome and a round room, as we would call the rotunda in the center of the Villa Rotonda. That's why it's called that. Jefferson's is a little different. The wings go out further. It's not a perfect square, but it does have a portico on all four sides. It has a porch on all four sides, I should say. And then another building, which certainly Jefferson probably saw. He was the American ambassador to England, to London. And this was designed by Lord Burleigh. It's Chiswick House. And here you see some of the other elements. It's based, as you can see, in part on the Pantheon and in part on the Villa Rotunda with the square building and the dome and the portico. However, it has a octagonal dome with this Palladian or arched window in the dome. And you can see that in Jefferson's home. I have to admit, I think the proportions of Jefferson's Monticello are just much more beautiful. The lower drum to the dome just seems to fit better, I think. Jefferson's home, it looks like, almost to us like it's almost like one story. It's actually 3 stories. There's a lower story, and then the main room with the main story, which we see here, and we also see in Chiswick House, and then an upper area, which is why you have windows in your dome. Now, this building and the other classical buildings that Jefferson designed were very influential on American art. We have Neoclassicism as a style for U.S. government buildings. Go to Washington, D.C. Now, here's the Capitol building. Now, that's definitely not by Jefferson. It's a 19th century building. But, you know, there it is, domed, classical. Why would a Roman style, essentially, be a good style for U.S. government buildings? Well, think about it. It harks back to such things as the Roman Republic. And the U.S. political system is in part based on the political system of the Roman Republic. They used it with some changes as a design for our system of government. We have a 2-house system of government. We have the Congress, the representatives, which are elected by the popular vote. And then each state has 2 senators. Senate, well, of course, the Roman patrician house of government was the Senate. And then there was the lower plebeian house, which I guess was our representatives, perhaps. So it was believed that classical architecture was appropriate for the new American Republic. I should also tell you that it was also seen as appropriate for the French Empire, because after all, the Romans also had an empire. Their republic fell, and they had a long Roman Empire. So you can use it to symbolize either of those things. And you may have heard of the Empire style, which refers to the French Empire under Napoleon, and was also very interested in Neoclassicism. And there's some more pictures of the U.S. Capitol building. That wasn't the original dome. They expanded it. Well, sometimes when I look at the U.S. Capitol dome, it reminds me of Bramante's Tempietto, only it's what I call the Tempietto on steroids. It's much expanded. And here's another very famous building in Washington, D.C., that's laid out very, very much like Jefferson's Monticello. It has a portico in front and a rotunda that is domed when you walk in. This is the National Gallery in Washington. And you go up the stairs, you go in, and there is a rotunda. And then the galleries are the wings off to the side. It, however, is not brick. It definitely is stone and marble. Probably the most famous of all of the neoclassical artists was Jacques-Louis David, who was the premier neoclassicist in the late 18th and a little bit into the 19th century. He believed that history painting was the most important type of picture, and he's famous for his history paintings. He also believed that painting should have a moral message, as we'll hear, and that line was the most important stylistic element. Line appealed to the mind, where, for example, loose brushwork or color would appeal to the emotions. Now, David, the very model of a French neoclassicist, worked for 3 different governments. He worked for King Louis XVI, the last king before the French Revolution. And of course, Louis XVI was guillotined. David worked for the revolutionary government. In fact, he was a French revolutionary. And he also worked for the emperor, Napoleon Bonaparte. Just as Holbein created the image of Henry VIII in England in the 16th century, David creates the image of Napoleon Bonaparte in the early 19th century. David not only worked for the revolutionary government, he was a deputy of the French Revolution, and he was on the panel that voted to execute the king, his former patron. During the revolutionary and Napoleonic governments, he was the virtual artistic dictator of France, and he favored a very austere form of neoclassicism. Line was much more important than color. So he does represent disegno, as late as the 18th and even early 19th century. He felt that line was much more important than color, that it appealed to the mind. And one of his artistic dictums was, never let your brushstrokes show. You had to smooth out the brushstrokes with a particular tool called a maul stick, which was a long stick with a soft tip of cloth or leather or something, and you could stand back and smooth out the brushstrokes. He favored history painting with a moral message and a rational appeal to the mind. First, we're going to look at one of David's works of art called The Oath of the Horatii. And first I'm going to look at it stylistically, and then I want to talk to you about the subject matter, the iconography, and the moral message that he tries to impart with this painting. You'll notice that the painting is set in a classical architectural setting with fairly fat columns and no fluting, very, very simple. This is to show that it was in the very, very early years of Rome. And you have a group of 3 men dressed as soldiers, as warriors. The older man, that is their father, is holding up 3 swords. And as you can see, they're taking their oath on the swords. To the side are their sisters, wives, and little children, who don't seem very happy about the whole thing. They have sort of collapsed in sorrow. They're not as tough as the men. You might notice that the female figures particularly are very idealized and beautiful, of course wearing classical garments, and that the whole picture is laid out in linear perspective, in planar recession. The men are parallel to the picture plane, the women just a little bit further back, the colonnade further back, and then of course the final wall within the architecture. I also have a little drawing to show you here, and you can see that this is a drawing for the Horatii, as they're called, the brothers. The oldest brother's name is Horatio or Horatius, and so all three of the brothers are called the Horatii, altogether. As you can see, it's exactly the same pose. This was the cartoon, the drawing that would be then transferred to the canvas. The scale is not correct here. The drawing would have been smaller. And you might notice that it's squared. There's horizontal and vertical lines that form a kind of grid. And this was a way of transferring, for example, a smaller image to a larger canvas. You could have the same squares, the same number of squares, but if it was a larger canvas, you would have larger number. And then you just sort of look and say, okay, I'm drawing in each square what fits there. And that's a way of blowing up your picture. So it shows that he wanted everything to be precise, everything to be planned out. Perfect example of disegno, line and planning of the design to be most important. Now, what is that subject? It is a history painting. It is a subject from Roman history. The Horatii are three Roman brothers. And this is very early in Rome's history, and there is another very nearby city called Alba. And the two cities are vying for supremacy in this area. You know, and whichever city wins the war will obviously go on to be, to expand and grow, and as we know, become the great Roman Republic eventually. But rather than have an all-out war, which has pretty devastating effects on the entire populace of both cities, the Albans and the Romans agree to triple combat. The Albans will choose 3 champions. The Romans will choose 3 champions, and they will battle to the death for their respective cities. And the last man standing, whatever his city is, will be the winner. The Horatii are chosen, 3 brothers who are believed to be the most skilled warriors. And here, their father holds up their swords. They are vowing on their swords to fight to the death for Roman victory. The women are upset. They fear that their husbands, their sons perhaps, their brother could be killed. But one of the women has an even sadder situation. Not only are her brothers going to fight for Rome, but for her beloved. Her lover is one of the Alban champions. So no matter who wins, she's going to lose either her lover or her brothers. Well, the story continues. They fight. All 3 of the Albans are killed. The 2 younger Horatii brothers are killed. Horatio returns victorious. And he finds his sister weeping for her beloved, one of the Albans. Now here's the moral message. What did Horatio do? And you might think, what would you do? What would be the moral thing to do under those circumstances? You'll have to answer that one for yourself. But, I would assume that under the circumstances, he'd probably try to comfort her. He wouldn't say anything stupid like, well, he's a dead Alban and that's only good Alban's a dead Alban or something like that. One would presume that he would show some sympathy. At the very least. That might be our moral message. But it wasn't Horatio's, and it wasn't Jacques-Louis David's. What did Horatio do in the story? He killed his sister. He stabbed her to death because she was weeping for an enemy of Rome. Now, there was an neoclassical play written about this story. And in the play, and in some other paintings, there's a big scene where the Romans are just horrified that their great champion has committed sororicide. He's done this horrible crime of killing his sister. And so in the scene, he displays his sister to the Roman people, and he has this great speech in which he explains, that she was unpatriotic and, she deserved it, essentially. And the Romans all say, oh, great, that's fine. But it's a really interesting reaction. No, I'll leave out interesting. It's not. But I don't know how many people today would kill their sister and think it was a good deed. So, what is the moral, patriotic message that Jacques-Louis wants us to get? That duty to the state outweighs personal considerations. Now, one of the interesting things about this painting is it was painted for the king. I always thought it was a perfect French Revolutionary kind of painting, until I found out that it was actually painted before the French Revolution. I was a student, and I thought, oh my goodness. So I'm sure when the king saw it, he thought that the message was that everybody should be loyal to him. Well, as we know, they weren't, and neither was Jacques-Louis David. I also want to show you a painting that was created for the revolutionary government. In fact, this was actually a painting that David painted for himself. It's called The Death of Marat. Marat was a French revolutionary. He wrote pamphlets, one of which incited a riot, and people went into the prison, into the Bastille, and just killed all the prisoners without trial. And so his writings led to that massacre. He had a skin disease. And so the treatment that the doctors recommended was that he should soak in a bath for just hours and hours a day. Well, he still needed to get his work done. So what he did, and what we see here, is he pretty much set up his bath as though it was an office. He arranged for a table, and he carried on his business in the bath. And as you can see, he's holding a petition in his hand. And he would see people, they'd come in with their petitions. Incidentally, in the painting, you can literally read the words on that petition. To the citizen Marat, from the citizen Charlotte Corday. He was assassinated. He was stabbed to death in his bath by Charlotte Corday. She brought a petition, and he was responsible for the death of family members. And so she stabbed him to death. And I want to point out something in this painting. If you look at the bottom of that table, it says, "A Marat David." To Marat. Signed David. So this was a very personal painting. Marat was a friend of David's. And how does he portray him? He portrays him as though he were a heroic martyr. The scene is calm, serene, and even the use of blood is restrained. It's not gushing and dripping all over with gore. You see that the blood has stained the bath water. Now there's just a little bit on the white sheet, dripping down. There's just a little tiny slash almost up his collarbone. I can't really see how that could have killed him. And then down below on the floor, we see the bloody knife in shadow. So once again, it's restrained. That was one of the things that the Neoclassicists believed, that you shouldn't be throwing out all this emotion, that art should appeal to the mind. It should be restrained. He has idealized Marat and portrays him with this very quiet scene that makes him appear to be, as I say, a heroic martyr, almost like a Roman who has been, I think Cicero opening his veins in the bath or something like that. He could almost be a figure out of Roman history. There is certainly a figure that he can be compared to. The pose of Marat with his arm hanging down is the pose of the dead Christ from Michelangelo's Pietà. I find it hard to believe that somebody who killed people can be seen as a Christ figure, but of course this is a very different political realm. And that is what he's trying to say, as Christ was a martyr who gave his life for the salvation of souls, I guess, for other people. So Marat has died for the cause of the French Revolution. One of the things that always surprised me about French history was the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. I couldn't understand it. I mean, they just killed their king. What do they want with an emperor? And then I was reading part of a book on Jacques-Louis David, and it explained things. It said that one of the objections to the kings were that they were kings without merit. They were kings simply because they were born to the right family. And the way the French saw Napoleon, who became the greatest general of his time, was that he rose by his own abilities, by his own merit. So he became emperor by merit. I said that Jacques-Louis David created the image of Napoleon. So here we see a portrait of Napoleon. It's in the National Gallery of Washington. It is in that characteristic position that we always say that we think of Napoleon with his hand in the waistcoat. And this is just beautifully painted. I mean, all of the still life details are just beautifully rendered. But that's not the picture that was in your text. This is the picture that's in your text. This is certainly one of the most dramatic Davids. It shows Napoleon crossing the St. Bernard. Now, when I say crossing the St. Bernard, we do not mean either the dog or the saint. It's the St. Bernard Pass going through the Alps. And it's not a realistic picture by any means. Napoleon was no idiot. He did not ride a rearing horse across the Alps with the little tiny mountain passes. He actually rode a donkey, which was be much more sure-footed. And so this really is political propaganda trying to make him look like a glorious, heroic figure on the rearing stallion. You'll notice how large he is in relationship to the horse, and yet we know that Napoleon was a very tiny man, short of stature. But we've seen that before. Remember the Gattamelata, where the Gattamelata was larger in proportion to the horse. It's a tradition to show the human being because horses are big and people are relatively small. So here, as I say, very dramatic, a little Baroque element almost of this drapery that billows out and figure standing up and even holding on with just one hand as he points the way. We're going over the Alps and we're going to conquer Italy. Boom. Just to let you know of the precedent, down written on the rock is not only the word Bonaparte, but also Hannibal. And remember that Hannibal crossed the Alps with his elephants. I don't think Napoleon brought elephants. Hannibal crossed the Alps and defeated the Romans. And of course that was horrible defeat from the Romans. And decades later they went back and completely laid waste to Carthage, which was Hannibal's home city. So he's comparing himself to the person who could conquer even Rome. Well, Neoclassicism continued into the 18th century. And the most famous of the next generation of neoclassicists was Dominique Ingres. Now, I try to show you pictures that are in your text. I have here a portrait. as well as one of the pictures in your text, because he painted many, many portraits. I guess you could say that was his bread and butter. Dominique Ingres was the leading neoclassicist of the next generation in the 19th century. He is famous for his history paintings, by which he made his reputation with a work called The Apotheosis of Homer, which won the grand prize, the Prix de Rome, which was a prize for the French Academy that the recipient would be allowed to go to Rome and study for a whole year. It paid his expenses, so it was a wonderful prize. Because of his success with history painting, he also had many, many commissions for portraiture. And he also painted many nude figures. Some were classical figures, and the others, which we'll see here, are kind of, say, imaginary harem girls. This is Ingres' painting of the Grand Odalisque, the large odalisque. The odalisque refers to the reclining figure of a nude woman that lives in a harem in the Middle East. One of the things you would like to look at first is the style. For David, line was rational. With Ingres, line becomes sensuous. There's one art historian who wrote that Ingres was sensuous despite himself. And all of his paintings have this beautiful, elegant, curving line as the basis of his art. Sometimes he even takes it, we might say, to extremes. He might sacrifice exact anatomy for elegant compositions. Here we see a figure that some people look at this and they say, oh, she's got extra vertebrae. Her back is so long and curving. And of course, then there's the swelling hips and the tiny little feet. Picture that I showed you originally, there's something very odd about the way that the far arm is attached to the shoulder. It doesn't quite make sense, but it's a beautiful, curving, elegant form. So Ingres takes liberties with the anatomy, and here we have the elongated back, the wide hips, and these tiny little feet. The subject, called an odalisque, is a French Western European fantasy about harem women. There's a great deal of interest in the Near East. You may remember that France actually had colonies in the Near East, controlled places like Algeria. And this whole idea of having a harem where you had your women locked away, they assumed, I guess, that they were all sitting there in the nude waiting for their lord and master to call them for sexual favors. Certainly there's a very erotic as well as exotic component of this painting, and certainly undoubtedly some of the reasons they were very popular. Harem women did not sit around in the nude. They had their own culture and probably spent a great deal of their life just with other women, and rather than just lying around like this. It has beautiful still life elements. This gorgeous stuffs, this peacock feather fan. And you might notice that the face is actually based on a Raphael Madonna. It's changed a little bit, regularized even more, I suppose. But Ingres was one of many people who believed that Raphael was the greatest artist that ever lived. But that's not exactly a Raphael. Sensuous lines, sensuous textures.